They raised me like a daughter until their real one came back. Then overnight, I became a stranger in the very house I helped build. Hi, I'm Elena. For 30 years, I poured my soul into a family business that never had my name on the door, but every success had my fingerprints. When they found their long-lost daughter, they cut me off without a word, just a quiet erasure. What they didn't know is that I still own 60% of the company. And I didn't come back for revenge. I came back to remind them who really built their empire. And if you've ever given your whole life to a place called home, only to be met with silence, stay. This story will understand you better than anyone ever has. I left the Wright estate on an early autumn morning when sunlight filtered through the curtains, but brought no warmth, only a harsh clarity that revealed every speck of dust on the ivory drapes. The light felt cold, as if the house had long been hollow of affection, or perhaps had never truly held any for me. My suitcase sat neatly by my feet, small enough that no one would believe it held 34 years of life, a worn sweater, a ribbon-tied notebook, and one photo, just one of me standing between the two people I once called parents. The corners were yellowed, the edges creased like memories someone had tried to crumple but hadn't yet thrown away. My adoptive mother stood on the porch, not stepping down to see me off. She didn't cry. She didn't say goodbye. She didn't even look me in the eye when she finally spoke. "That girl is our blood," she said, her voice calm like a blade. "And you are a gesture of kindness. But kindness, Elena, has its limits." I nodded, not because I agreed, but because there was nothing left to say. I had grown used to silence. In this house, I had learned how to walk, softly speak just enough, and never ask for more than a corner to stand in. I used to think if I gave enough, tried hard enough, they would eventually see me as one of their own. But perhaps I had been wrong from the start. Their long-lost daughter Emily had appeared 3 months ago with a DNA test and a French-accented voice. From the moment she stepped past the iron gates, I knew my place in their world would evaporate. But I didn't expect it to vanish so quickly, not with a confrontation, not with blame, just quiet exclusion. And fewer chairs at the dinner table. My adoptive father didn't come outside, but I saw him watching from behind his office window, a cigar gripped tightly in his hand. He didn't look at me, or perhaps he hadn't truly seen me since the day Emily called him Dad with trembling joy. Maybe in his heart, I had only ever been a placeholder, a shadow cast until the real thing returned. I stepped through the gates for the last time, my suitcase rolling over the granite path I had personally hired workers to renovate last year. I used to think that if I helped them build a beautiful home, they would want to keep me in it. I hadn't realized that the home was never built for me. I had always been a guest with an expiration date, quietly counting down to the day their true daughter came back. The autumn wind slipped through my hair, carrying the scent of dry leaves and something faintly metallic like rust or regret. I didn't cry, not because I was strong, but because the ache had long since grown calloused. Like tea left out too long, not burning but bitter nonetheless. I looked back one last time. The estate still stood grand proud and utterly untouched by my absence. As if I had never lived there, as if my 30 years were just a nameless dream, erased from the memory of a family who once called me daughter. I slipped the photo into my coat pocket close to my heart, not because I longed for the past, but because I needed a reminder that I had loved, and that love had nearly made me forget my worth. A taxi pulled up. The driver asked where I was headed. I smiled faintly. "The train station," I said. "I've got an appointment with my future." And as the car turned off that tree-shaded street, lined with old oaks, I didn't look back again, because I knew the place I left behind was no longer home. I was brought into the Wright family when I was 4 in age, when a child barely understands what it means to lose a mother, yet is expected to call a stranger mum. Mrs. Wright used to stroke my hair and say, "Elena, you're a gift God sent us when we were lost." And I believed her. Children believe what's repeated with a soft voice. We believe in hugs, even the stiff ones. We believe love can be learned as long as we behave. Growing up in that house, I always tried harder than a normal child would. I excelled in school not to be praised, but to not be a burden. By 7, I was helping with chores, not because anyone asked me to, but because I wanted to be kept. Every holiday season, I was the only kid in class who set an alarm to wake up early and make breakfast for Mom and Dad while the others waited for presents. I truly believed that if I was good enough, smart enough, loyal enough, they would one day see me as their own. And I lived by that hope for 3 decades. When I turned 23, my adoptive father, Mr. Wright, was diagnosed with early-stage prostate cancer. My mother fell apart. Wright and Daughters, their family company, was staggering after a failed investment. I turned down an internship in Chicago to return home and manage the business. I remember that afternoon in his office vividly. He set down his whiskey glass and looked at me with more worry than I'd ever seen in his eyes. "I need you to help with something, Elena. If I keep the assets in my name, the banks will take everything. You're the only one I trust." I nearly choked on pride. Not because I was capable, but because for the first time he'd said, "the only one I trust." I signed, didn't read the whole contract, didn't ask a lawyer. 60% of the company's shares were transferred to my name as a temporary safeguard, they said. They promised to switch it back. I never asked, because I didn't think I needed to. I didn't sign to own anything. I signed because I believed I was their daughter. I worked for the company without a salary the first 2 years. Morning coffees for the executives, afternoon financials, evenings I stayed late formatting reports. I stood in for my father at shareholder meetings while he was in Houston for treatment. I ran operations, retained clients, slashed costs, and pulled the company from the brink of collapse. After one particularly grueling quarter, my mother hugged me in the boardroom and said, "Even if you were our blood, I couldn't be prouder." That sentence once meant everything to me. It burned like a quiet candle in my chest whenever I felt tired. It reminded me that I wasn't invisible. But all of that changed the day Emily returned from France DNA results. In one hand, a teardrop-shaped pendant, in the other one my mother recognized instantly. That same evening, I knew I was being replaced. My mother made beef bourguignon, Emily's favorite. My father spent hours listening to her Parisian tales, cutting me off mid-sentence when I tried to speak. The next morning, I was invited to take a break, to give Emily time to get used to the company. I smiled and said I understood, that I was fine. But that night, I carefully folded every file on my desk, like someone quietly closing the door on a place they once called home. They called Emily the daughter we lost. They told me, "You should be happy for the family, Elena. This is the miracle we've waited for." But what was I in that miracle? A shadow, a substitute. A placeholder for a love paused and now resumed. I don't regret the years I gave them. I don't resent the love I once believed was real. But what I cannot forgive is how they treated my loyalty like a product that had passed its shelf life. They forgot I was the one holding 60% of the company. And they also forgot some daughters don't need shared blood to know the difference between love and betrayal. For 2 whole years I vanished from the world I had once helped build. No goodbyes, no explanations. The business world whispered that I had crumbled after a family crisis. A few online articles called it a regrettable retreat of a silent talent. But the truth, I didn't disappear. I simply went quiet to prepare for a return they'd never see coming. I lived in a small apartment in Midtown, no nameplate, no assistants. By day, I studied advanced corporate finance, risk management, international commercial law. By night, I worked with a discreet team of attorneys. None of them knew the full story, but they understood my intent. I told them, when I return, I want there to be no room for denial. And they helped me deliberate precise, as if sharpening a blade. I told no one in the family, not out of spite, but because I wanted them to truly believe I had accepted my role as once was, so that when I did return, the look on their faces would be sharp enough to cut through every lie they'd ever wrapped in silk. The spring shareholders' meeting took place on a clear Monday morning. Wright and Daughter's headquarters still stood there, grand, polished, reflecting light like a mirror that never showed the cracks beneath. I arrived unannounced. No receptionist recognized me. My once long, honey-brown hair was now trimmed short and dyed a cool shade of ash simple functional. Forgettable even. Perfect. 17th floor. Boardroom. Still the same wooden table where I used to sit beside my father, whispering financial figures into his ear when fatigue clouded his mind. Now that seat belonged to Emily, their hand-picked interim CEO. She wore a pale suit and a rehearsed smile, presenting IPO strategies to investors like she was born to do it. No one noticed me enter. Not until I laid the folder on the table. The sound of it hitting the wood echoed dry clean, like a bell tolling in a room that had mistaken stillness for security. "Apologies," I said softly, my voice calm as breath. "But I believe this meeting lacks proper representation." Emily turned. Her eyes flickered just for a second before she quickly regained her composure. "Elena," she said, half laughing, "what are you doing here? This is a high-level board meeting." "Precisely," I replied, sliding the folder toward the executive panel. "And as the shareholder who holds 60% of Wright and Daughters, I believe I'm entitled to speak." Silence fell. My father's eyes widened. My mother clenched the arms of her chair. The old firm lawyer in the corner leaned forward, flipping open the folder, scanning each page. "I've held these shares for the last 8 years," I continued. "Legally, notarized, taxed, unconditional. I never transferred them, never revoked them." Emily stood abruptly. "That's impossible. Mom and Dad already reassigned those shares years ago. I'm the appointed CEO, appointed by whom I asked cutting her off. The board only requires majority consent, and I am the majority." I turned to the board and legal counsel. "I do not approve of Emily Wright serving as CEO. I request immediate suspension of her authority and the formation of a restructuring committee." The room buzzed, pages flipped. A young investor whispered, 60%, "Is this real?" My father rose to his feet. His face seemed to age a decade in moments. "Elena, you don't have to do this. If there's been a misunderstanding, we can speak privately." I looked at him. The man who once told me, "You're the only one I trust," now calling me Elena after 2 years of silence. Too late. "You call me daughter now," I said. "You cut me off, stripped me of titles. Not once did you ask where I was. Not once did you call. And now, because I'm still worth something on paper, I matter again." There was no need to raise my voice. The documents had already spoken for me. Emily cast a desperate glance toward my mother, but my mother said nothing. The room split in half, those clinging to the illusion of family, and those just now realizing who had been the backbone of this empire all along. At last, the firm's lead attorney stood and addressed the room as the rightful holder of 60% of shares. Ms. Elena Wright holds full veto authority. The IPO process will be suspended immediately, and the board will undergo a formal audit and restructuring. I nodded, not triumphant, not vengeful, because this wasn't a victory. It was a reckoning, the final frostbitten step of a woman who once loved and was cast aside. As I walked out of the room, Emily remained frozen in place. She didn't call me sister, my mother didn't cry, and my father didn't follow. But this time I didn't need them to, because this time I held the keys. News of the boardroom turned Cold War spread in under 48 hours. Financial headlines read, "Adopted daughter holds, 60% of Wright & Daughters CEO suspended." Entertainment media turned it into a modern Greek tragedy. The daughter they cast aside returns with power in her hand and a heart turned to stone. I didn't read them. I didn't need to. Everything that followed played out exactly as I expected. Wright & Daughters stock froze. Transactions stalled. The IPO was postponed indefinitely pending internal review. Investors began pulling out not because the numbers looked bad, but because they no longer trusted a family that had betrayed the very woman who built their name. Emily's suspension was more than ink on paper. She was stripped of signing rights, barred from issuing statements, denied entry to the 17th floor entirely. She changed her hair, her wardrobe, even her tone, but nothing could erase the truth the chair she sat in was never hers to begin with. I resumed operations quietly. No fanfare, no press release. I simply walked in, opened the door, and did what should have been done years ago. 3 weeks passed before the first message arrived, an unknown number. I didn't answer. Then came the text, just one line. "Come home for dinner." "Mum," I stared at the words. A late invitation from the same woman who once said kindness. "Elena has an expiration date." I didn't reply. On the third day my father called, not from a masked number, but from his own once saved in my phone as Dad Home, now long erased. I picked up. "Elena." His voice was rasped no longer, the booming authority of Boardroom's past. "Can you come talk to us? We're still a family, aren't we, family?" That word landed in my ear like a drop of water into an already overflowing glass. "I used to think so," I said calmly. "Until the day you told me blood matters more than love." He went silent. No protest. Perhaps deep down he knew my words were the only truth left standing among the ruins of what we used to call a home. But the collapse didn't stop there. Emily's wedding was called off. Her fiancé, an investment advisor, backed out once he realized all her personal assets were entangled with a company she no longer had any legal right to. My mother was removed from the Women's Business Council not because of the scandal, but because reverence fades when loyalty is revealed to be negotiable. One afternoon, as I exited the building, I saw my father sitting alone on a bench by the parking lot. He wore a faded coat. His hair had silvered more than I remembered. I passed him. I didn't mean to stop, but he looked up. "Elena, if you could, just give your parents a way out." I paused. Didn't turn. "Do you know why I never went back to that house?" I said. "Because I no longer know where home is." He didn't respond. I walked on. I don't hate them. I just don't believe in them anymore. There's no feeling left that qualifies as anger, only a fine layer of cool ash. No fire, no heat, but still impossible to wipe clean. To outsiders, I was the woman who returned sharp, precise, unbothered. But somewhere deep inside, I was still that 4-year-old girl, once holding her mother's hand by the window, believing that if she was good enough, they would never let her go. I didn't come back for revenge. I came back for myself, what was left of me in the rubble they left behind. And when they came asking for mercy, I didn't lock the door. I just didn't open it. Late afternoon, the top floor of Wright and Daughters caught the last golden sliver of sunlight, thin as a veil draped across memory. Elena sat alone in an office, still laced with the scent of fresh wood and warm ink, a space once called the seat of power, now quietly shifting beneath her steps. She wasn't working. She didn't turn on the lights. She just sat there, arms folded across her chest, letting the light fade on its own, like hopes that had once flickered and quietly died out. Below the city was lighting up. The streets crossed each other like a web of choices, some rightmost irreversible. I'm not their blood, she thought, but I'm the one who kept their name from going bankrupt. And sometimes the children they cast aside are the last ones who still know what honor means. On the desk, tucked between financial reports and apology letters from former shareholders, sat a faded velvet box. Elena opened it. Inside lay the company's founding ring, once worn by her adoptive father, quiet and cold in its resting place. 14K gold. Etched in delicate letters, W&D, 1982. She held it to the light, letting the last rays of the day strike its worn surface. Once that ring had symbolized inheritance, a seamless circle of trust. Now it was just an object. The gold remained intact. The meaning had long eroded. She didn't wear it. She simply held it, then set it gently back into the box. And this time, she locked the drawer not to hide it, but to seal it like a testimony. A memory that no longer needed to be revisited. Elena rose and reached for her coat. The office behind her remained still, like it had been the day she first entered their lives, quiet, expectant. Only now, she didn't need anyone waiting. She didn't need anyone to witness her presence. She didn't need to be loved anymore. She stepped out, not away from them, but out from the shadow they had cast over her, light for too long, and when the door closed, only her name remained alone steady. No more Wright, just Elena. Enough.